I knew the exact second she crossed the line, because it sounded like steel teeth grinding against something they had no right to touch. The metallic clank echoed through the cold morning air before I even made it to the front door, and by the time I stepped onto my driveway barefoot, the smell of diesel exhaust was already thick enough to taste. My truck, my father's 1978 Ford F-250, was halfway up on a flatbed, its tires hanging just inches above the concrete like it was being erased in slow motion. The tow operator didn't even look at me. He just kept tightening the chains, methodical, practiced. And there she was, standing 10 feet away on the edge of my lawn, heels planted in the grass like she owned the ground under them, clipboard tucked under one arm, watching it all happen with that same calm, polished smile. Sharon Holloway, HOA president, neighborhood gatekeeper, executioner in a pressed blazer. Community blight has consequences, she said, like she was announcing the weather. I didn't yell. I didn't run. I didn't touch the truck. Instead, I stood there with the cold concrete biting into my feet, phone steady in my hand, recording every second, the license plate, the company logo, the timestamp blinking in the corner. Because what she didn't know, what she couldn't know standing there so sure of herself, was that she hadn't just taken my truck. She'd just handed me exactly what I needed. The hydraulic lift whined as it locked into place, a sharp mechanical sound that cut through the quiet neighborhood like a blade. A couple of blinds shifted across the street. Someone cracked their door open just enough to watch. Nobody said a word. Nobody ever does when Sharon decides to make an example out of someone. The truck settled onto the flatbed with a final heavy thud, and I felt it in my chest more than I heard it. That truck wasn't just metal and rubber. It was weekends with my dad under an open hood, the smell of grease and coffee mixing in the garage, his voice telling me to tighten bolts twice and trust once. And now it was being hauled away like it didn't belong to me, like I didn't belong here. The driver climbed back into his cab, engine rumbling low, and I caught Sharon's reflection in my phone screen as she adjusted a strand of hair and checked something off her clipboard. Efficient, clean, final. That's how she liked it. You'll receive the paperwork, she added, already turning away, already done with me. I lowered the phone slowly, letting the silence stretch just long enough for the truck's taillights to disappear at the end of the street. Most people would have chased it, argued, begged, paid whatever number showed up on the invoice just to make the problem go away. But I didn't move. Not yet. Because the truth was, I needed her to believe she'd won. I needed her comfortable, confident. I needed her to keep going exactly the way she always had, pushing just a little further, cutting just one more corner. The morning air felt different as the diesel fumes faded, thinner somehow, sharper. I slipped my phone into my pocket and looked down at the empty space where the truck had been sitting for years, the faint outline of its tires still pressed into the concrete. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't the loss. This was the setup. She thought she towed my truck. What she actually did was start something she wouldn't be able to stop. I had known Sharon Holloway for 3 years before she ever gave me a real reason to understand her. Not know her, understand her. There is a difference, and it took a towed truck to make it clear. She moved into the neighborhood the same year I finished the garage renovation, arriving with a white Lexus that never collected dust and a perfume that arrived in a room before she did. Something sharp, expensive, designed to be noticed without asking permission. She ran for HOA president 6 weeks after moving in. Nobody ran against her. People rarely did. On paper, she was a senior real estate broker, the kind who sold homes in the same neighborhood she shaped, whose listings always seemed to photograph cleaner, sell faster, and appraise higher when the surrounding streets looked a certain way. Manicured, quiet, aspirational. She had a word she used at every board meeting: integrity. She said it the way people say it when they mean compliance. Her ex-husband had been a real estate attorney, sharp man, from what I heard. The kind who knew exactly which clauses to write and which ones to leave vague. They split 4 years ago, and whatever she kept from that marriage, it was not sentiment. It was method. What I did not know, what none of us knew until later, was that the man she had been seeing for the past 2 years owned the towing company with the contract to service our neighborhood. Not a big operation. 3 trucks, a storage yard on the county line, and a billing system that charged by the hour from the moment the wheels left the ground. Clean on paper, profitable in practice, and deeply, quietly connected to every enforcement notice Sharon had signed since the contract began. She did not hate me personally. That would have required her to see me clearly. What she saw was a truck that looked like work, a garage that smelled like labor, and a property that reminded anyone passing by that not everyone in this neighborhood had arrived the same way she had. That was enough. For Sharon, image was not cosmetic. It was the product, and anything that disrupted the product had to be managed. That was the real reason. Not the truck. Not the bylaw. The truck was just the excuse she had been waiting for. And the thing about people who operate on image, they never consider what happens when someone starts documenting theirs. The storage yard sat on the far edge of the county line, the kind of place that looks temporary even when it has been there for decades. Chain link fence, gravel lot, a small office with a window thick enough to muffle everything except the smell of rust and tire rubber that drifted under the door. I arrived with everything. Registration, insurance, current photos of the truck in operational condition, a printed copy of the HOA bylaw section on vehicle enforcement, with the relevant passage highlighted in yellow. I had the kind of documentation that should have ended the conversation in under 5 minutes. The man behind the counter looked at my folder the way people look at something they have already been told to ignore. "You the Bennett vehicle?" he asked, not looking up. "That is my truck, yes," I said. He tapped something into his computer, waited, then shook his head with the practiced ease of someone who had delivered this exact answer before. "Release pathway has to be cleared through the HOA. Until they send authorization, the vehicle stays in hold status." I set the folder on the counter, keeping my voice level. "The HOA is not the registered owner." "I am." "That is correct," he said, still not looking at me. "But the pull order came through their account, so the release has to come from them too." I stood there for a moment, letting that settle, because what he had just described was not a towing policy. It was a loop. My truck had been taken by an entity that did not own it, and could only be returned by the same entity that took it. No court order. No appeal window listed. Just a system that closed around itself and waited for the person inside it to run out of patience or money, whichever came first. "I want to see the vehicle," I said. "Liability policy doesn't allow owner access during hold status," he replied. And this time he did finally look at me, not with hostility, just with the flat certainty of a man who had repeated this sentence enough times that it no longer required thought. I picked up my folder. I looked at the clipboard on the wall behind him, the one with the intake log, names and dates and vehicle descriptions filling the lines in tight, consistent handwriting. Even from where I stood, I could read 2 of them. Alvarez, Kowalski, names I recognized, addresses I knew. I did not say anything else. I thanked him, and I meant it, because he had just told me more than he realized. I walked back to my truck, sat in the driver's seat, and looked at that chain link fence for a long moment before pulling out my phone and starting a new document. At the top, I typed one line, "This is not the first time." And then I started writing down every name I had seen on that clipboard. The HOA meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the clubhouse, the same room where they announced landscaping schedules and debated holiday light policies. Folding chairs. A projector screen nobody used. The smell of bad coffee and good manners stretched thin. I arrived early. I had prepared the way I prepare for any job where the margin for error is 0. Every document in order, every timestamp cross-referenced, every argument built from the ground up so it could not be dismissed on a technicality. 12 residents attended. Most of them sat toward the back, the way people sit when they want to be present without being visible. Sharon opened the meeting the way she always did, calm, precise, already in control of the room before anyone else had adjusted to the lighting. She acknowledged my request to speak, gave me exactly 3 minutes, and clasped her hands on the table in front of her like a woman who had already read the last page of this story. I laid it out clean. The timeline discrepancy. The lack of visible posted notice at the moment of tow. The bylaw language that required written warning before enforcement action. I placed copies on the table in front of each board member. I spoke without raising my voice. When I finished, Sharon smiled, the same smile she had worn in my driveway, and said, "We appreciate you sharing your concerns, Cole. The board will deliberate." The deliberation took 4 minutes. "Enforcement action upheld," she said, and moved on to the next agenda item before the echo of her own words had faded. A few of the residents near the back exchanged glances. One woman started to say something and stopped. Nobody else moved. I gathered my documents, nodded once, and walked out. The parking lot air hit me like cold water, sharp, clarifying. I stood next to my car for a moment, not out of defeat, but because I needed to feel the full weight of what had just happened before I decided what to do with it. That was when I heard footsteps behind me. Measured, deliberate, like someone who had been waiting for the room to empty. I turned. It was an older man I recognized from the far end of the block, retired, kept to himself, the kind of neighbor who waves but does not linger. He looked at me for a second without speaking, then reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and held out a folded piece of paper. "This happened to my son-in-law 2 years ago," he said quietly. "Different truck. Same. Signature at the bottom." I took the paper, unfolded it, looked at the date, the language, and the name signed at the bottom of the enforcement notice. Sharon Holloway. I looked up, but he was already walking away, hands back in his pockets, moving like a man who had said exactly what he came to say and not one word more. I looked back down at the paper in my hand, at the date printed at the top, 14 months before the current bylaw version had even been adopted, and felt something settle in my chest that was not anger. It was direction. The next morning started quieter than it should have, and that was what made it feel wrong. No engines, no footsteps, just the low hum of the neighborhood settling into routine like nothing had shifted, like a truck had not been pulled off my property less than 24 hours earlier. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when my phone buzzed again, not from the HOA this time, but from a client. Then another, and another. By the third call, I already knew what was happening before I even answered. "Hey, Cole," the voice on the other end said, hesitant, like he was choosing his words carefully. "I heard there might be some compliance issues with your shop. HOA flagged something. I think I am going to hold off on that restoration for now." The line went quiet after that, and when I hung up, the coffee in my hand tasted different, bitter in a way that had nothing to do with the roast. It did not stop there. By noon, 2 more jobs were postponed, and a parts supplier I had worked with for years suddenly needed clarification on whether I was still operating within local guidelines. The message was spreading, and it was spreading fast. Sharon had not just taken my truck. She had started reshaping the story around me. I stepped outside into the driveway again, the heat already building off the concrete, and I could feel eyes on me even if I could not see them directly. A car slowed slightly as it passed, then kept going. Across the street, a curtain shifted just enough to confirm what I already knew. People were watching, but not to help. To decide, to measure whether I was still someone safe, to associate with, or if I had become the kind of problem Sharon had warned them about. That was the real escalation, not the towing, the isolation. I went back into the garage, the familiar smell of oil and metal grounding me again, but even that felt thinner now, like something had been pulled out of the space along with the truck. Lily was sitting at the workbench, her notebook open but untouched, her pen tapping lightly against the wood in a rhythm that told me she had been listening to every call. "They are saying things at school," she said without looking up. "About you. About the shop." Her voice was steady, but there was something under it, something tight. I leaned against the edge of the bench, crossing my arms, forcing myself to stay calm. "People repeat what they hear," I said. "That does not make it true." She finally looked up at me then, eyes searching, not for an explanation but for certainty. "Are we okay?" she asked. That question hit harder than anything Sharon had done so far, because it cut straight through the noise and landed where this actually mattered. For a moment, I saw exactly how this could go if I handled it wrong. The shop slowing down, the pressure building, the temptation to just pay, to just comply, to make it stop before it reached her. That was the second layer of the system. It did not just target you. It made you responsible for protecting everyone around you from the consequences of resisting. I straightened up, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "We are not just okay," I said. "We are going to be better than okay." That night, after the call stopped and the garage had gone quiet, I did something I had not done in over a year. I pulled down the metal box my father kept on the top shelf above the workbench, a dented gray thing with a clasp that still stuck the same way it had when I was 12 years old. Inside was the usual collection of a man who trusted paper more than memory. Warranties, receipts, a folded map of a highway route he had driven so many times he no longer needed it. Old business cards held together with a rubber band that had long since lost its tension. And at the bottom, in a manila envelope sealed with tape that had yellowed at the edges, a contract. County Emergency Recovery Services. Subcontractor agreement for towing and vehicle recovery operations following declared weather events. Signed by my father. Dated 18 years ago, renewed twice, and terminated only because the county reorganized its vendor registry after a budget cycle. My father had pulled vehicles out of flooded streets 2 counties over. He had driven that F-250 into conditions that most towing companies declined to quote. He had done it for a rate that barely covered fuel because he believed that when your county needed help, you showed up. I sat with that contract in my hands for a long time, looking at his signature at the bottom, the same wide, deliberate letters he used to teach me to write. The same truck that had worked those roads was now sitting in a storage lot, classified as a community nuisance. I folded the contract carefully, placed it back in the envelope, and set it on top of my folder. This was not just my evidence anymore. It was his too, and I was going to use every piece of it. Because by now, the pattern was clear. Sharon was not improvising. She was following a method. Apply pressure, control the narrative, isolate the target, then wait for them to fold. It probably worked most of the time. People have bills, families, limits. But there was a flaw in that method, and I could see it now more clearly than ever. It relied on speed, on pushing everything forward before anyone had time to slow it down and examine it closely. And that was where she had made her mistake. Because I was not going to move faster. I was going to move slower. That afternoon, I made 3 more calls. One to the contact who had already confirmed the towing irregularities, one to a fleet owner I trusted who understood compliance better than most inspectors, and one to someone at the county level who owed me a favor from a job years back. I did not ask for help outright. Not yet. I asked questions. Specific ones. About timelines. About documentation. About what happens when procedure is skipped, and who gets notified when it is. Each answer added another piece to the picture, another confirmation that what had happened was not just questionable, it was trackable. By the time the sun started to dip lower, casting long shadows back across the empty driveway, I had something I did not have that morning. Not control. Not yet. But direction. I stepped outside one more time, the air cooling just enough to take the edge off the heat, and looked at that same empty space again. It no longer felt like something taken. It felt like something being set aside, waiting for the right moment to be returned. And as I stood there, listening to the distant sound of a truck engine somewhere beyond the neighborhood, I realized Sharon had just escalated this beyond a simple dispute. She had made it public. She had made it visible, which meant when it came back, it was not going to be quiet. The only question left was how many people were going to be watching when it did. I did not go looking for proof that day. It came to me in pieces, quiet, and almost easy to miss if I had still been thinking like someone trying to solve a problem instead of someone watching a system crack. It started with a callback from the fleet owner I had reached out to the night before, a man named Dennis who had spent 30 years in towing compliance and knew the difference between a clean job and one that cut corners just by the way a truck was parked. "I ran the company name you gave me," he said, his voice steady but carrying that low edge of interest that meant he had found something. I stepped out into the garage, the smell of warm rubber and old oil hanging in the air as I leaned against the workbench, giving myself space to think while he talked. "They have had warnings before," he continued. "Documentation issues, timing violations. Nothing that stuck long enough to shut them down, but enough to build a pattern. A pattern." That word settled in, heavier than anything else he could have said. One mistake can be explained. A pattern means intention. I walked slowly toward the open garage door, looking out at the street where everything still looked perfectly normal, and asked the question that mattered most. If they skipped procedure on a removal, what does that open up? There was a pause on the line, not hesitation, just calculation. "Depends on how clean the paperwork is," Dennis said. "If the timestamps do not line up or the notice window was not honored, that is not just a mistake. That is a violation that can trigger review at the county level." I nodded to myself, even though he could not see it, because that lined up exactly with what I had been seeing. Fast movement. Missing steps. Confidence built on the assumption no one would check closely enough. After I hung up, I went back to the video again, slower this time, frame by frame, letting the details speak instead of my frustration. The angle of the truck when it pulled in. The lack of visible notice posted at the moment of tow. The way the operator moved straight to securing the vehicle without documenting its condition. Each piece by itself might have been dismissed. Together, they formed something harder to ignore. That was when my second call came through, the one from the county contact I had not spoken to in years. His tone was different, more cautious, like he already understood there was more behind the question I had asked earlier. Cole, if you are dealing with a tow under HOA authority, there are still baseline requirements, he said. Notice timing, documentation, verification. If those are not met, it can escalate beyond the HOA. I leaned against the doorframe, the warm air outside pressing in as I let that settle. How far beyond? I asked. Another pause, shorter this time. Far enough that it does not stay internal, he replied. That was the crack. Small, precise, but real. I ended the call and stood there for a moment, listening to the distant sound of traffic beyond the neighborhood, the kind of background noise that usually fades into nothing, but now felt like a reminder that this place was not as isolated as Sharon believed. Systems overlap, rules connect, and when one part breaks, it does not always stay contained. I went back inside and opened the folder again, but this time I was not looking at it as proof to present. I was looking at it as a map. Every document, every timestamp, every line of text was a point I could connect to. Something larger. That was when I noticed something I had missed before. The time listed on the HOA notification did not match the time the truck had been removed. It was close, but not exact. Off just enough to matter if someone cared to compare it against independent footage. I felt a small shift in my chest. Not relief. Not yet, but recognition. They had moved too quickly. They had written the outcome before they secured the process. And in doing that, they had left a trail that did not line up cleanly. I closed the folder and set it down, the weight of it different now, not just evidence, but leverage waiting to be used at the right moment. Outside, a neighbor walked past with a dog, giving me a brief nod before looking away, the kind of interaction that said everything without saying anything at all. People were still watching, still deciding, still waiting to see which way this would go. I stepped back into the driveway, the concrete cooling under the late afternoon shade, and looked at that empty space again. It had become something else entirely now. Not a loss, not even a problem. It was a starting point that connected to something bigger than one truck or one HOA decision. And as I pulled my phone out and started drafting a message to the two people who had just confirmed what I needed to hear, I realized Sharon had done more than overstep. She had created a situation that could not stay small. The only thing left was deciding when to let it expand, and how many people would be standing there when it did. I stopped thinking in terms of whether I could prove she was wrong and started asking how many ways I could prove it at the same time. Because one inconsistency can be argued away, but a pattern that lines up from multiple angles is a different kind of problem entirely. That night, after Lily went to bed, I sat alone in the garage with the overhead lights buzzing faintly and the smell of warm metal settling into something steady, and I built everything out piece by piece. Laptop open, phone beside it, folder spread across the workbench like a blueprint. I pulled the HOA notification back up and froze on the timestamp again, then cross-checked it against the video metadata from my phone, then against the security camera feed from the neighbor across the street who had quietly agreed to share it after I knocked earlier that afternoon. The numbers did not align. Not by much, but enough that no one looking closely could call it clean. The notice was issued before the tow had actually been completed. That meant the decision had been recorded as final before the required verification steps were finished. It was subtle, the kind of thing most people would never notice. But in systems like this, sequence matters. I leaned back slightly, letting that sink in, then moved on to the next layer. I pulled up the HOA bylaws, the version I had signed when I bought the house, then the amended version posted on the community portal, and then a third version that had been circulated in an email 6 months ago that most people probably never opened. There were differences. Small wording shifts around enforcement authority, around what qualified as a violation, around how notice was defined. None of it looked dramatic on the surface, but when I lined it up against what had actually happened, it became clear that Sharon had been operating in the gray space between those versions, choosing whichever language supported her action in the moment. Not illegal by itself, but not clean either. Not consistent. An inconsistency is where things start to break when you apply pressure. I kept going. I pulled up the towing company's public filings, cross-referenced their license status, then dug into prior citations Dennis had mentioned. 2 warnings for improper documentation within the last 18 months. 1 for failing to maintain accurate tow logs. Again, nothing that shut them down, but enough to establish that cutting corners was not new behavior. That mattered, because it meant what happened to me was not an isolated mistake. It was part of a habit. I could feel the shape of it forming now, not just a single incident, but a chain that connected decisions, timing, and incentives. That was when I found the detail that shifted everything from suspicion into something much harder. In the HOA financial summary, buried 3 pages into a report most residents would never read, there was a line item labeled Enforcement Coordination Services. It did not list a company name, just a monthly amount that was too consistent to be incidental. I cross-checked the timing of those payments against the increase in enforcement notices over the past year, and the pattern tightened. More notices, more removals, more fees, more payments flowing through that same line item. I sat there for a long moment, the quiet of the garage pressing in around me, listening to the faint ticking of the cooling air unit and the distant hum of a car passing somewhere beyond the neighborhood. It was not proof of anything on its own. Not yet. But it was direction. It showed motive. It showed that enforcement was not just about rules. It was tied to something that benefited from escalation. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the pieces settle into place, then opened them and looked back at the empty space where the truck had been. This was no longer just about getting it back. It was about exposing how it had been taken in the first place. And that required more than documents. It required timing, visibility, witnesses. I reached for my phone and started organizing everything into a sequence, labeling files, backing up copies, making sure nothing could be dismissed as incomplete or out of context. Each step felt deliberate, controlled, like tightening bolts in the right order so the whole structure holds under pressure. I was not rushing. That was the difference now. Every minute the truck stayed in that lot, every hour the fees ticked up, every conversation Sharon had with the board thinking this was already resolved, it all added weight to what was coming next. I stood up and walked to the garage door, looking out at the street under the dim glow of porch lights, the neighborhood settling into night like it always did, calm on the surface, unaware of what was building underneath. Somewhere out there, my truck was sitting in a storage yard, tagged, logged, reduced to a line in someone else's system. But not for long, because now I had something she could not see yet. Not just a mistake, not just a gap, a structure. And once you understand how something is built, you also understand exactly where to apply pressure to make it come apart. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and turned off the lights, letting the garage fall into darkness, already knowing the next move was not about acting fast. It was about choosing the moment when everything she had set in motion would be impossible to hide, and making sure there were enough eyes on it when that moment arrived. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I already knew this was not something I could finish alone, not because I needed help getting the truck back, but because what I had uncovered was bigger than one person pushing paperwork across a desk. Systems like this survive on isolation, on people dealing with problems individually, quietly, one at a time, never comparing notes. The moment those notes start to line up, the system stops being invisible. So instead of going back to the HOA, instead of making another call to argue the same facts, I started knocking on doors. Not randomly, carefully. The kind of careful that comes from knowing exactly what you are looking for. The first house I went to was across the street, the same one whose camera footage had already helped me confirm the timing issue. Mr. Alvarez opened the door slowly, like he had already guessed why I was there. The smell of coffee drifted out from behind him, warm and familiar, and for a second it felt like a normal conversation could happen. "I figured you might come by," he said quietly. I nodded, holding the folder at my side but not opening it yet. "I am not here to argue about what happened," I told him. "I just need to know if it has happened before." He hesitated, eyes shifting slightly past me toward the street, then back. That pause said more than any answer could. "Not like that," he said finally, "but close." He stepped aside just enough to let me in, and within minutes he was pulling out a notice he had received 6 months earlier. Different wording, same tone, same escalation pattern. I did not react, just took pictures, noted the date, the signature, the language. Another piece, another connection. From there, it spread faster than I expected. Not because people suddenly became brave, but because once one person realized they were not the only one, the silence started to crack. A retired couple 2 houses down had paid a fine for a violation that never quite made sense at the time. A single mother at the end of the block had her son's work truck flagged for commercial presence, even though it never left their driveway overnight. Each story had its own details, its own small differences, but the structure was identical. Notice: pressure, compliance, quiet resolution. Nobody had pushed far enough to see what happened if they did not fold. Until now. By mid-afternoon, I was back in the garage with more than just my own documentation. I had a pattern that stretched across multiple homes, multiple incidents, all feeding into the same process Sharon controlled. I laid everything out on the workbench, the papers overlapping slightly, edges catching the light as I moved them into order. The air felt different now, heavier with purpose instead of uncertainty. Lily walked in halfway through, stopping just inside the doorway, taking in the spread of documents without saying anything at first. "That is a lot," she said eventually, her voice quieter than usual. I nodded, not looking up right away. "It is enough," I replied. She stepped closer, glancing down at the pages, the notes, the timestamps. "So what do you do with it?" she asked. That question hung there for a second, not because I did not have an answer, but because the answer was not simple. "I do not use it yet," I said finally. "Not like this." She frowned slightly, trying to follow. "Then why gather it?" I straightened up, meeting her eyes, making sure she understood this part. "Because when it happens, it has to be bigger than just us," I said. "It has to be something they cannot explain away." She nodded slowly, still processing, but I could see the shift in her expression. Less worry, more understanding. That mattered. Outside, the neighborhood carried on like it always did, cars moving in and out, people walking dogs, conversations happening just out of earshot. On the surface, nothing had changed. But underneath, something had already started to move. People were talking now, even if it was quiet, even if it was behind closed doors. And once that starts, it does not stop easily. I gathered the papers into a tighter stack, organizing them into sections, labeling each one with the same precision I used in the shop. Evidence, timeline, pattern, each category building on the last. This was no longer about reacting to what Sharon had done. It was about preparing for what she would do next. Because she would not stop. Not now. Not when she believed she was in control. And that was exactly what I needed. I set the folder down and reached for my phone, scrolling through the contacts I had been adding throughout the day, each name representing another piece of the system I was about to connect. This was the point where most people would act, where they would take what they had and try to end it quickly. But ending it quickly was never the goal. Not anymore. I looked out at the empty driveway one more time, the fading light stretching long shadows across the concrete, and realized something that made the entire situation shift again. Sharon thought she had isolated me. What she had actually done was bring everyone else into the same frame. And once that frame came into focus, there was no way she was going to control what it showed. By the third day, the pressure had shifted in a way Sharon could not see yet, and that was exactly where I needed it. The truck was still sitting in their lot, the fees quietly stacking the way she intended, each hour designed to push me closer to a decision she thought I would eventually make. But instead of reacting to it, I let it sit. I let the clock run. Because every hour that passed without me paying, without me filing that appeal she expected, added weight to what I was building. That morning, I met Dennis in person for the first time since all of this started. His office sat just off a service road outside the main part of town, the kind of place where the smell of diesel and paperwork mixed into something permanent. He did not waste time with small talk. He spread out a blank pad on his desk, grabbed a pen, and looked at me like he already knew I was not there for a quick answer. "Walk me through it again," he said. I laid out the timeline, every detail from the moment the tow truck pulled in to the exact wording of Sharon's response at the HOA office. He listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally, then started drawing lines on the paper, connecting events, marking times, circling gaps. "They moved too fast," he said finally, tapping the page. "And they assumed you would move faster." I leaned back slightly, letting that settle. "So what happens if I do not?" I asked. He looked up at me, and for the first time, there was something close to a smile. "Then you get to choose the stage," he replied. That was the confirmation I needed. Not just that there were violations, but that timing was the leverage. I left his office with a clearer plan, the kind that does not rely on force or argument, but on alignment. That afternoon, I made another set of calls, not to complain, not to escalate, but to coordinate. The fleet owner agreed to be on standby, not for a job, but for presence. The county contact confirmed that if a formal review was triggered with sufficient documentation, it would not stay behind closed doors. And the neighbors who had shared their experiences agreed to something simple but powerful. They would show up, not to protest, not to argue, just to be there. Visibility was the one thing Sharon had not accounted for. She controlled the narrative when everything stayed private. She lost that control the moment multiple perspectives appeared at once. By early evening, the plan had a shape to it, not fully executed yet, but solid enough to hold. I walked back into the garage, the overhead lights flickering on with that familiar hum, and stood for a moment in the space that had always been mine to control. Lily was sitting on the stool again, watching me with that same quiet focus she had developed over the past few days. "You figured it out, did not you?" she said. I nodded once, not rushing the explanation. "I figured out when," I said. She tilted her head slightly, waiting. "Not today, not tomorrow, but soon," I added. She considered that, then asked the question I knew was coming. "What about the truck?" I looked past her, out toward the driveway, the empty space now something I had learned to read differently. "It stays where it is," I said. "For now." That answer would not have made sense a few days ago. It would have felt like giving up ground. Now it felt like setting a trap, because every day the truck remained in their system, every fee they added, every internal note they logged thinking this was routine, it all became part of the record, part of the pattern, part of the story that would eventually be impossible to ignore. The next piece came late that night, when an email notification hit my phone, this time from the HOA again. A reminder. Fees updated. Language just formal enough to sound routine, but with an edge that suggested they were starting to expect a response. I read it once, then again, and instead of reacting, I saved it, filed it, added it to the timeline. Another data point. Another confirmation that they were continuing exactly as predicted. I set the phone down and stood in the quiet of the garage, the air cooler now, the distant sound of traffic fading into the background. Everything was moving, just not in a way anyone else could see yet. And that was the advantage. Because when this shifted, when the pieces came together in the open, it would not look like a reaction. It would look like something that had been inevitable from the moment she decided to move that truck. I turned off the lights and headed back inside, already knowing the next step was not about doing more. It was about waiting just long enough for her to believe she had already won, because that was the moment she would be the least prepared for what was coming next. The call came earlier than I expected, and that was the first sign something had shifted faster than planned. It was not from the HOA this time, not from Dennis, not even from one of the neighbors. It was from the storage yard. The voice on the other end was neutral, almost bored, like he had made this call 100 times before. "Mr. Bennett, I am calling regarding the vehicle currently in our possession," he said, reading from a script that did not leave room for interpretation. I stepped out onto the back porch, the morning air still cool enough to carry the faint smell of wet grass, and listened without interrupting. Due to outstanding fees and lack of initiated release process, the vehicle is now being reviewed for accelerated lien handling, he continued. Accelerated. That was new. That was not part of the standard timeline Dennis had outlined. I felt the shift immediately, not panic, but pressure moving in a direction I had not scheduled. "How accelerated?" I asked, keeping my voice even. There was a pause, papers shuffling on his end. "Within 48 hours, the status may change from storage to disposition review," he said. Disposition. A clean word for something final. I thanked him, ended the call, and stood there for a second longer than I needed to, letting the weight of it settle. This was the second trap, and it was tighter than the first. Not just financial pressure anymore, but time compression. They were trying to force movement, to push the situation past the point where careful planning mattered. I went back inside and grabbed my phone, pulling up the timeline I had built, scanning through the entries, the timestamps, the patterns I had been mapping so precisely. Everything still held. The inconsistencies were still there. The connections still lined up. But now there was a new variable. Less time than expected. Lily was already at the kitchen table, her backpack half packed, watching me in that quiet way she had developed over the past few days. "Something changed," she said, not asking, just stating it. I nodded once. "They are trying to move it faster," I replied. She frowned slightly. "Does that mean you are running out of time?" For a moment, I did not answer. because on the surface, it looked like that was exactly what was happening. The fees had not pushed me to act, so now they were adjusting the timeline, trying to close the window before the pressure I was building had a chance to surface. It was a smart move. Aggressive, but not clean, and that mattered more than anything else. It means they are making another mistake, I said finally. She held my gaze for a second, then nodded slowly, trusting the answer even if she did not fully understand it yet. I stepped back into the garage, the overhead lights flickering on, and pulled the folder open again, this time moving faster, not rushing, but tightening the sequence. The lean acceleration did not erase what had already happened. It added to it. It created another point where procedure had to be followed precisely. And based on everything I had seen so far, precision was not their strength. I picked up the phone and called Dennis first. He answered on the second ring. "They are accelerating," I said without preamble. There was a brief silence, then a low exhale on the other end. "That is risky," he replied. "For them." That was all I needed to hear. I ended the call and immediately dialed the county contact. This time, the conversation was shorter, more direct. I outlined the situation, the original violation, the documentation gaps, and now the accelerated lien timeline. There was a pause, then a shift in tone on his end, something more formal. "If what you are describing is accurate, and if you have the documentation to support it, this will not stay at the HOA level," he said. "You need to be ready when it triggers." I hung up and stood there for a moment, the hum of the garage lights steady above me, the empty space in the driveway still visible through the open door. This was the point where most people would panic, where they would abandon the plan and try to salvage what they could before it was gone. I could feel that instinct there, sharp and immediate. "Go now. Hey, stop it before it moves further." But that instinct was exactly what this acceleration was designed to trigger. And if I followed it, everything I had built over the past few days would collapse into the same quiet resolution Sharon expected from the start. I took a slow breath, letting it out evenly, and closed the folder again, more deliberately this time. The plan was still intact. The timing had shifted, but not in a way that broke it. If anything, it pushed everything closer to the point where it could no longer be contained. I reached for my phone one more time, scrolling to the group of contacts I had been assembling. The ones who now understood what this was really about. It was time to move the next piece forward. Not all of it. Not yet. Just enough to meet the pressure without losing control. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up, cars pulling out of driveways, engines starting, people moving through routines that had not changed, even as everything underneath had. And as I stepped out into that same morning light, I realized something that made the situation feel less like a risk and more like a pivot. They thought accelerating the process would force my hand. What they did not understand was that it forced theirs too. And once both sides are moving at the same time, the one who planned ahead is the one who decides how it ends. The morning it finally broke open did not feel dramatic at first, and that was what made it so precise. The sky was clear, the kind of washed blue that makes everything look ordinary even when it is not. And the neighborhood was already gathering around the clubhouse for the HOA's Community Image Initiative. The same event Sharon had been promoting all week like it was a celebration instead of a performance. I stood at the edge of my driveway, the concrete cool under my boots, phone in my hand, watching people walk past in pressed shirts and polite smiles, unaware that the story they thought they were attending was not the one about to unfold. Lily stood just behind me, quiet, steady, her presence sharper than any words. "Is this it?" she asked softly. I nodded once. "This is where it changes," I said. I did not move right away. Timing mattered more than motion, and I could already feel the shift in the air, the way conversations lowered just slightly when my name passed between people, the way eyes lingered a second longer than usual. They were expecting something, even if they did not know what. Then I heard it. Low at first, distant, a steady diesel rumble that did not belong to the usual morning traffic. It grew slowly, not rushing, not aggressive, just deliberate. Heads started turning down the main entrance road, curiosity pulling attention in a single direction. The first truck came into view, clean, marked, moving at a controlled pace. That made it impossible to ignore. Then another behind it. And another. By the time the third rolled through the gate, the entire front of the neighborhood had gone quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Phones came out without anyone being told to take them out. The convoy did not rush. It did not need to. It carried its own gravity. At the front, mounted on a flatbed, was my truck. Cleaned, secured, visible from every angle. Not hidden in a yard. Not reduced to a line item. Presented exactly for what it was. I stepped forward as the lead truck eased to a stop near the clubhouse, the engine settling into a low idle that hummed through the pavement. The rest of the convoy lined up behind it in a straight, controlled sequence, each vehicle positioned with intention, each one carrying either a documented case, a witness, or a piece of the system Sharon thought she controlled. Dennis stepped out from the second truck, clipboard in hand. Not hers, not decorative, but filled with aligned documentation. The county representative arrived moments later, not announced, not introduced, just present, his badge visible enough that people noticed without needing explanation. And then Sharon appeared. She moved through the crowd with the same composure she always carried. But there was something different now, something tight around the edges of her expression, like she was trying to process too many variables at once. "What is the meaning of this?" she asked, voice controlled but sharper than before. I did not raise mine. I did not need to. "Delivery," I said simply, gesturing toward the truck. "Completed." A few people shifted closer, forming a loose circle around the scene, drawn by the same instinct that makes people watch something when they know it matters, even if they do not understand why yet. Dennis stepped forward, opening his folder, laying out the timeline in a voice that did not argue, did not accuse, just connected facts in a sequence that could not be separated once heard. Notice issued before tow completion. Missing documentation. Inconsistent bylaws. Pattern of repeated enforcement tied to financial flow. Each point landed clean, not rushed, not forced. And the more it built, the quieter the crowd became. Sharon tried to interrupt once, then again, but each attempt fell flat against the structure that had already been laid out in front of her. This was not a debate. It was alignment. The county representative stepped forward next, his tone neutral, procedural, but carrying weight that did not need volume. "We are going to need to review all enforcement actions connected to this vendor and these notices," he said, looking directly at Sharon. Immediately. That word hung in the air longer than anything else that had been said. Not delayed. Not internal. Immediate. I watched the shift happen in real time. The moment where control changes hands without anyone announcing it. The same neighbors who had stayed quiet days before were now standing close enough to see everything clearly, their attention no longer divided, no longer uncertain. Visibility had replaced assumption. And once that happens, it does not reverse. I stepped to the side as the flatbed lowered slightly, just enough to reposition the truck without fully unloading it, a deliberate pause, a visual statement that this was not just about getting it back, but about showing how it had been taken. Lily moved closer to me, her hand brushing mine briefly, grounding, real. Sharon stood still now, no clipboard, no notes, just the space around her narrowing as the system she had relied on started to answer to something larger. And as the engines idled and the documentation continued to move from hand to hand, I realized something that settled everything into place. This was never going to end in a quiet office or a private resolution. It was always going to end here, in the open, where every piece she had set in motion could be seen exactly for what it was, and where there was no version of the story left for her to control. The engines eventually went quiet, but the silence that followed was not the same kind I had stood in days earlier. This one carried weight, the kind that settles in after something has been seen clearly for the first time and cannot be unseen. People did not scatter right away. They stayed where they were, shifting slightly, talking in low voices that no longer tried to hide behind closed doors. The county representative moved through the documentation with a measured pace, asking questions that did not sound aggressive but did not leave room for avoidance either. Dennis stayed near the trucks, calm, steady, answering when needed and saying nothing when silence carried more impact. And Sharon, she stood where she had been, but the space around her had changed. It was no longer authority. It was distance. I stepped forward when it mattered, not to argue, not to add anything new, just to confirm what had already been laid out. "That truck stays documented until the review is complete," I said, my voice even, directed at the representative rather than her. He nodded once. "It will," he replied. That was it. No negotiation. No delay. The process she had relied on had shifted out of her reach, and everyone standing there understood it without needing it explained. The flatbed adjusted slightly again, lowering the angle just enough that the truck could be secured for transfer under supervision instead of private control. It was a small movement, almost technical, but it carried a different meaning now. It was no longer being held against me. It was being held as evidence. Lily stood beside me, her posture straighter than I had seen it in days, her eyes moving between the truck and the people around it, taking everything in. "So it is not over yet," she said quietly. I shook my head slightly. "No," I answered, "but it is not theirs anymore." That distinction mattered, because what came next was not about winning in that moment. It was about what followed when the system had to answer for itself. Over the next few days, things moved in ways Sharon could not slow down. Notices went out, not from the HOA, but from the county. Requests for records. Requests for clarification. The towing company's operations were reviewed, not just for my case, but for every case tied to the same pattern. The line item I had found in the financial report did not stay buried. It surfaced, questioned, traced. And once it was traced, it did not point to something simple. It pointed to a structure that depended on staying unnoticed. The neighborhood shifted too. Conversations that had once been quiet became open. People compared notices, timelines, fees. What had been isolated incidents became a shared understanding. And once that happened, the silence Sharon had relied on disappeared completely. I did not need to push it. I did not need to add anything. The structure I had mapped out was now moving on its own, each piece connecting to the next without my intervention. A week later, I stood back in my driveway as the truck was returned, not with urgency, not with resistance, but with documentation, signatures, and oversight that made every step visible. The engine was quiet when it rolled down, but the weight of it felt different under my hand when I touched the door, like something had been restored beyond just metal and paint. I opened it slowly, the familiar smell of worn leather and engine oil still there, unchanged despite everything that had happened. Lily climbed up into the passenger seat, running her hand across the dashboard with a small smile that said more than any words could. "Feels the same," she said. I nodded. "It is," I replied. But it was not just the truck. The driveway felt different. The neighborhood felt different. Not because something loud had happened, but because something had been exposed in a way that could not be hidden again. Sharon was no longer at the center of anything. Her name still came up, but not with authority. With questions. With investigations. With consequences that moved beyond the small space she had controlled for so long. And as I stood there, the late afternoon light stretching across the concrete, I realized the part that mattered most was not the moment the truck came back. It was everything that made it impossible for it to be taken that way again. I closed the door gently, the sound solid and familiar, and looked out at the street where people moved a little more openly now. Conversations no longer cut short when someone walked by. The system had not just been challenged. It had been seen. And once something like that is seen clearly, it does not go back to what it was. Sharon thought she had removed a problem from the neighborhood. What she actually did was reveal the one thing she could never control. What happens when people stop dealing with things alone and start looking at them together? And in the end, that was the part she never planned for. The part that made everything else inevitable. The truck sat back in its spot in the driveway that evening, exactly where it had always been, the faint outline of its tires settling back into the concrete like something returning to the shape it had always held. I stood in the garage doorway for a while, not doing anything in particular, just listening to the neighborhood. Cars, distant dogs, the low hum of a lawnmower 2 streets over that someone had started too late in the day to finish. Lily came and stood beside me, close enough that our shoulders almost touched. She did not say anything for a minute. Neither did I. She really thought it would just go away, Lily said finally. Most of the time it does, I replied. That is how it works. Until it doesn't. She was quiet again, and then, because of the hound box. I almost smiled. She had called it that since she was 7. The metal box, the hound, the thing that always tracked something down. Partly, I said. My phone buzzed on the workbench. Unknown number, local area code. I almost let it go. Then something made me pick up. Mr. Bennett, a woman's voice. Measured, professional, with the particular precision of someone used to asking questions people did not expect. My name is Rachel Voss. I cover municipal accountability for the Courier Register. I've been looking into HOA enforcement patterns in 3 counties, and your situation came up in our research. I understand you may have documentation I haven't been able to access through public records. I looked out at the truck, sitting solid and still in the fading light. I have documentation, I said. Would you be willing to talk? I leaned against the doorframe, the same spot I had stood in the morning this all started, when the only thing I could do was record what was being taken from me. Ms. Voss, I said, I've been waiting for someone to ask. I hung up and set the phone down. Lily looked at me with a question. She had not yet put into words. Is it over? She asked. I looked at the truck one more time, then at the folder on the workbench, then at my father's box, sitting exactly where I had left it. The part that was about us. I said, yes. I picked up the folder and handed it to her to hold. Just for a moment, just the weight of it. The rest of it is just beginning. She thought towing my truck would make me disappear. Instead, it gave me a parade route straight through her empire. And when the story finally ran, our neighborhood was just the first paragraph.